The February wind cut through the Montana territory like a blade forged in hell's own forge, carrying with it the bite of winter that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs before he had a chance to speak. Luke Carver pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders as his horse, Rusty, picked his way through snow that reached halfway up the gelding's legs. The Bridger Mountains loomed to the west, their peaks lost in the gray-white sky that threatened more snow before nightfall. Luke had been riding since dawn, making the monthly supply run to Henderson's trading post 15 miles down the valley. His saddlebags bulged with coffee, flour, salt pork, and the few luxuries a man living alone could justify. A tin of peaches, a small bag of peppermint sticks that reminded him of Christmas mornings from a childhood that felt like someone else's life. At 32, Luke had been managing his ranch alone for the better part of 8 years, ever since his father had taken ill and passed during a particularly harsh winter. The land was hard, but it was his, and he'd learned to find satisfaction in the rhythm of seasons, the reliable cycle of feeding cattle, mending fences, and preparing for whatever the Montana wilderness chose to throw at him. The snow began falling again as he crested the ridge that marked the halfway point to his cabin. Fat, wet flakes that stuck to everything they touched and made the world seem smaller, quieter, as if God had wrapped the entire territory in cotton batting. Rusty's hooves made soft, muffled sounds in the fresh powder, and Luke found himself listening to the silence between the horse's steps, the way the wind seemed to carry voices from far away. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought it might be a coyote or perhaps an injured animal caught in a trap. The sound was thin, weak, barely audible over the wind. Luke pulled Rusty to a stop and sat still in the saddle, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. There it was again. Not an animal. A human voice, calling out. Luke's hand moved instinctively to the rifle secured to his saddle. Living alone in the territory meant being prepared for anything, claim jumpers, rustlers, or worse. But as he listened more carefully, the sound didn't carry the edge of threat. It was something else entirely. Something that made his chest tighten with a feeling he couldn't quite name. He urged Rusty off the main trail, following the sound through a stand of bare cottonwoods whose branches clattered together like old bones. The snow was deeper here, untouched except for the delicate tracks of rabbits and the occasional impression of deer hooves. The crying grew louder as he approached a small clearing where the remnants of an old fence line marked what had once been someone's attempt at homesteading. What Luke saw there made him forget the cold entirely. A woman was tied to one of the broken fence posts, her wrists bound with rough rope that had rubbed the skin raw and bloody. Her dress, what had once been a decent brown wool garment, was torn and mud-stained, offering little protection against the elements. Dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face that bore the purple and yellow marks of recent violence. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and ice crystals clung to her eyelashes. But it was what lay at her feet that made Luke's heart stop altogether. A small bundle wrapped in what looked like a torn petticoat moved slightly in the snow. The weak crying he'd been following wasn't coming from the woman. It was coming from whatever was inside that makeshift blanket. Luke dismounted so quickly he nearly lost his footing in the deep snow. He approached slowly, his hands visible, the way he might approach a wounded animal that could still bite. Ma'am," his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, brown eyes, he noticed, the color of coffee beans but clouded with pain and exhaustion. She tried to focus on him, and when she did, something like terror flickered across her features. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible. Don't take me back there." Luke knelt beside the bundle in the snow and carefully pulled back the fabric. Inside was a baby, A boy, he guessed, perhaps 6 months old, with fine brown hair and skin that was far too pale and cold. The child was alive but barely moving, his tiny fists curled against his chest. "Jesus," Luke breathed, then looked up at the woman. "How long have you been here?" She tried to speak but only managed a weak shake of her head. Luke could see that she was close to losing consciousness again, her body giving in to the cold and whatever ordeal had brought her to this place. There was no time for questions, no time to wonder about the circumstances that had led to this moment. Luke pulled his hunting knife from his belt and carefully cut the ropes binding the woman's wrists. She slumped forward, and he caught her before she could fall face first into the snow. "Easy now," he murmured, the same tone he used with injured horses. "I've got you." Luke shrugged out of his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around both the woman and the baby, then lifted them as carefully as he could. The woman weighed almost nothing, and he could feel her shivering against him as he carried her to where Rusty waited patiently in the snow. Getting them both onto the horse was a challenge, but Luke managed to settle the woman in the saddle, the baby cradled in her arms, while he walked alongside, leading Rusty by the reins. The wind picked up as they made their way back to the trail, and Luke found himself talking to keep them all moving. "Not much farther now," he said, though he wasn't sure the woman could hear him. "Got a warm cab and good fire, get you both warmed up and fed." The baby made small, weak sounds that worried Luke more than he cared to admit. He'd helped birth calves and foals, had some experience with the basics of keeping young things alive, but a human child was different, more fragile, more complex. As they trudged through the deepening snow, Luke found himself wondering what kind of man would leave a woman and baby tied to a fence post in the middle of a Montana winter. The thought made something dark and angry stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the war, when he'd learned that some people were capable of cruelties that defied understanding. The woman stirred in the saddle, her eyes opening again as they approached the final ridge before his cabin came into view. "Where?" she began, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "At my place," Luke replied. "You're safe now." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slightly and closed her eyes again. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke's cabin sat in a small valley protected by stands of pine and aspen, with a clear view of anyone approaching from 3 directions. Smoke was still rising from the chimney. He'd banked the fire well before leaving that morning. The sight of it filled him with relief that surprised him. He helped the woman down from the horse and carried both her and the baby inside, where the warmth hit them like a physical thing. Luke settled them in the wooden chair beside the fireplace and quickly built up the fire until flames were dancing high and bright. The cabin wasn't much. One room with a sleeping area partitioned off by a hanging blanket, a small kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, and the main living space where he ate his meals and spent his evenings. But it was warm and dry and safe, and right now that seemed like everything in the world. Luke moved efficiently, bringing thick quilts from his bed to wrap around his unexpected guests, heating milk from his cow in a small pot on the stove. The baby had stopped crying, which worried him until he saw the tiny chest rising and falling steadily. "What's his name?" Luke asked quietly as he handed the woman a tin cup of warm milk. She looked down at the baby in her arms, and for the first time since he'd found her, something soft crossed her features. "Samuel," she said. "His name is Samuel." Luke nodded. "And you?" She hesitated, as if even giving her name might put her in danger. "Clara," she said finally. "Clara Duval." "Luke Carver," he replied, "and this is my place." Clara sipped the warm milk slowly, color gradually returning to her cheeks. Luke could see that she was young, probably not yet 25, and that beneath the bruises and exhaustion, she was pretty in a quiet, sturdy way that spoke of strength rather than delicacy. "Mr. Carver," she said after a long silence, "I need you to know, there might be people looking for me, people who would want to take me back." Luke was checking the baby's temperature with the back of his hand, relieved to feel warmth returning to the tiny body. He looked up at Clara's words, noting the fear in her eyes. "Anyone comes here looking for trouble," he said quietly. "They'll find more than they bargained for." It wasn't a boast or a threat, just a simple statement of fact delivered in the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. But something in his eyes must have convinced Clara that he meant it, because she relaxed slightly in the chair. Outside, the wind continued to howl around the cabin, but inside, the fire crackled warmly and cast dancing shadows on the walls. Luke busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans and cornbread, glancing occasionally at his guests. The baby, Samuel, was sleeping peacefully now, his color much improved. Clara watched Luke's movements with careful attention, as if cataloging every detail of the space and the man who had brought her here. "Mr. Carver," she said as he set a plate of food beside her chair, "why did you help us?" Luke paused in his movements, considering the question. It wasn't something he'd really thought about. Seeing people in trouble and helping them seemed as natural as breathing. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said finally. Clara studied his face in the firelight. Not everyone would have stopped. "Maybe not," Luke agreed. "But a man's got to be able to look at himself in the mirror each morning." As the evening wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, Luke found himself stealing glances at Clara and the baby. There was something about having other people in his cabin that felt both strange and strangely right. The sounds of another person moving around, the soft murmur of Clara's voice as she spoke to Samuel, even the different rhythm of breathing in the space, it all added a dimension to the cabin that Luke hadn't realized was missing. But underneath it all was the knowledge that someone had hurt this woman badly enough to leave her tied to a fence post in a blizzard. Someone who might very well come looking for her. Luke checked his rifle and made sure it was loaded before banking the fire for the night. Whatever Clara's story was, whatever had brought her to that fence post, he had a feeling their troubles were just beginning. As he settled into his bedroll on the floor, giving Clara and Samuel the bed behind the partition, he listened to the wind outside and thought about the changes that a single day could bring to a man's life. That morning, he'd been Luke Carver, solitary rancher, answerable to no one but himself. Tonight, he was responsible for 2 lives, and the weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar coat. He'd worn that weight before, during the war, and he'd learned that some burdens were worth carrying, no matter how heavy they became. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up, and Luke found himself hoping it would last long enough to cover their tracks completely. Something told him they were going to need all the time they could get. Dawn came slowly to the Montana territory, filtering through the single window of Luke's cabin like pale honey poured through cheesecloth. The storm had blown itself out sometime during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow that sparkled in the early light. Luke had been awake for the better part of an hour, listening to the subtle sounds of his guests stirring behind the partition, the soft murmur of Clara's voice as she spoke to Samuel, the rustle of quilts, the gentle sounds of a mother tending to her child. He'd built up the fire while they slept, taking care to move quietly around the cabin. The coffee was already brewing in the pot on the stove, filling the space with the rich, familiar smell that had become as much a part of his morning routine as checking on the livestock. But this morning felt different. The presence of other people in his home changed everything. from the way he moved around the familiar space to the careful consideration he gave to each sound he made. When Clara finally emerged from behind the partition, carrying Samuel wrapped in one of Luke's quilts, she looked considerably better than she had the night before. The color had returned to her cheeks, and though the bruises were still evident on her face, her eyes were clearer, more alert. She'd managed to tidy her hair somewhat, though it still hung loose around her shoulders, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had taken a beating, but whose spirit was gradually reasserting itself. "Good morning," Luke said quietly, not wanting to startle her. He poured coffee into a second tin cup and held it out to her. "How are you feeling?" Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Better. Thank you. Much better." She looked down at Samuel, who was gazing up at her with the solemn expression that seemed to be his natural state. "We both are." Luke nodded toward the table, where he'd set out plates and utensils. "Figured you might be hungry. Got some eggs from the chickens this morning, and there's bread from yesterday's baking." The simple domesticity of the moment struck Clara with unexpected force. She couldn't remember the last time someone had prepared breakfast for her without expecting something in return. Couldn't recall when she'd last sat at a table where the atmosphere was peaceful rather than charged with tension and unspoken threats. As Luke moved around the small kitchen area, preparing their meal with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to taking care of himself, Clara found herself studying him more carefully than she had the night before. He was tall, probably a few inches over 6 feet, with the kind of lean, wiry build that spoke of hard physical work rather than soft living. His brown hair was slightly too long, as if he'd been putting off a trip to the barber, and his hands, she noticed, were scarred from years of ranch work but gentle when he'd handled Samuel the night before. There was something reassuring about his presence, something that made the tight knot of fear that had been living in her chest for weeks begin to loosen slightly. He moved without unnecessary haste, spoke only when he had something worth saying, and treated her with a courtesy that didn't feel calculated or performed. "Mr. Carver," she said as he set a plate of eggs and bread before her, "I need to tell you something about why you found me the way you did." Luke settled into the chair across from her, his own breakfast untouched. "Only if you want to," he said. "But if there's something I need to know to keep you and the boys safe, then I'd be grateful to hear it." Clara took a bite of the eggs, surprised by how hungry she was. When had she last eaten a full meal? She couldn't remember. "Roy Duval," she began, the name leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. He was my husband, is my husband. Legally speaking." Luke waited, not pressing her to continue but clearly listening. It wasn't a marriage I chose," Clara said carefully. "My parents died of cholera 2 years ago, and Roy was my father's cousin. He had some legal claim to our farm, and the judge in town, well, he and Roy had business dealings. The judge said the best way to settle the matter was for Roy and me to marry. Keep everything in the family, he said. She shifted Samuel to her other arm, the baby's weight familiar and comforting against her chest. "Roy isn't a kind man. Mr. Carver, he has a temper, and he drinks. And when he's angry..." She touched her cheek unconsciously, where the worst of the bruising was still visible. Luke's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained level. "And the boy?" Clara's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back quickly. "Samuel isn't Roy's son. Before the marriage, before everything changed, there was someone else, a man named Thomas who worked at the mill in town. We cared for each other." But when my parents died and the judge made his ruling, Thomas knew there was nothing he could do. He left town the day before the wedding. But you were already carrying the boy. Yes. The word came out barely above a whisper. Roy found out 3 months after we were married. I'd been able to hide it at first, but eventually, he was furious. Said I'd made a fool of him, that everyone in town would know the child wasn't his. He threatened to get rid of Samuel after he was born. Luke felt something cold and dangerous settle in his stomach. Get rid of him how? There's an orphanage in Helena. Roy said he'd take Samuel there, tell them he was an abandoned child we'd found. He said no one would ever know, and we could start fresh. Clara's voice broke slightly. I couldn't let that happen. Mr. Carver, Samuel is all I have left of Thomas, and he's my son. Mine. I'd die before I'd let Roy take him away. So you ran. I tried to run. I packed what little I could carry and left in the middle of the night during the new moon, thinking the darkness would help hide us. But Roy discovered us missing before dawn. He came after us with some of his men. He employs several hands who aren't particular about the work they do, if you understand my meaning. Luke understood perfectly. The territory was full of men who would do questionable work for the right price, men who operated in the spaces where law enforcement was thin or corrupt. They caught up with us at the old Hendricks place, you know it, the abandoned homestead with the broken fencing. Roy was so angry. He said I'd embarrassed him, made him look weak in front of his men. He said he was going to teach me a lesson about running off, and then he was going to take Samuel to Helena himself. Clara paused, taking a shaky breath. They tied me to that fence post and left us there. Roy said the cold would either kill us both or teach me that I needed him to survive. Either way, he said, the problem would be solved. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of what she'd shared. Luke stared down at his untouched breakfast, his hands clenched into fists on the table. When he finally looked up, Clara was surprised by the controlled fury in his eyes. How long were you out there? Most of the night and into the next day. I think time became difficult to track. Samuel was getting so cold and I was afraid. She looked down at her son, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. I was afraid we were both going to die there. Luke reached across the table and gently touched her hand where it rested on Samuel's blanket. You're safe now, he said quietly. Both of you. Roy Duval doesn't know where you are, and even if he did, he'd have to go through me to get to you. There was something in his tone that made Clara believe him completely. This wasn't empty bravado or masculine posturing. It was a simple statement of fact delivered by a man who clearly meant every word. Mr. Carver, I can't ask you to put yourself in danger for us. Roy has money and influence in town, and he's not the kind of man who gives up easily. If he finds out you're helping us, let me worry about Roy Duval, Luke said. Right now. What matters is getting you and Samuel healthy and keeping you safe. Over the next several hours. Luke threw himself into that task with the same methodical efficiency he brought to all his work. He heated water for Clara to wash with. Found her one of his extra shirts to wear while her dress dried by the fire. He warmed goat's milk for Samuel and showed Clara how to feed the baby with a spoon when he proved too weak to nurse properly. Throughout it all, he maintained a careful distance that Clara found both respectful and somehow comforting. He didn't hover or fuss, but he was always nearby, always alert to what they needed. When Samuel began crying from what seemed to be a stomach ailment, Luke produced a small bottle of peppermint oil and showed Clara how to rub a tiny amount on the baby's belly to ease his discomfort. Learned that from my mother, he explained when Clara looked at him in surprise. She used to say peppermint could cure just about anything that ailed a person. You know a lot about caring for babies, Clara observed. Luke shrugged. Helped raise my younger brother after our mother died. Benjamin was just a toddler then, and my father wasn't much good with the day-to-day care. A man learns what he needs to learn. Where is your brother now? California. Went west during the gold rush and decided to stay. Last letter I got, he was doing well for himself. Has a wife and 2 children of his own now. There was no bitterness in Luke's voice, but Clara sensed a loneliness there that resonated with her own experience of families scattered and lost. As the day wore on, Clara found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't been able to for months. The cabin felt like a sanctuary, with its thick walls and warm fire and the comforting presence of a man who seemed genuinely committed to their safety. She watched Luke as he moved around the space, noting the small kindnesses he offered without fanfare. The way he kept the fire built up just a little higher than necessary, because he'd noticed she was still cold. The way he spoke softly when Samuel was sleeping. The way he'd positioned himself between them and the door without making it obvious that he was doing so. By evening, Samuel was nursing successfully for the first time since their ordeal, and Clara felt strong enough to help Luke prepare supper. It was a simple meal, beans and cornbread again, with some preserved vegetables from Luke's root cellar, but sitting at the table together felt almost normal, almost like what a family might be. Mr. Carver, Clara said as they finished eating, I need you to know that I don't have any money to pay you for your kindness. Roy never let me handle our finances, and when I left, I could only take what I could carry. I don't have anything to offer you in return for what you've done. Luke looked at her steadily. I'm not looking for payment, Mrs. Duval. Sometimes people help each other because it's the right thing to do. Nothing more complicated than that. Clara felt tears threaten again. It's been so long since anyone was kind to me without expecting something in return. I'd almost forgotten that people like you existed. People like me? You good people, decent people. She looked around the cabin, at the simple furnishings and the well-maintained space that spoke of a man who took pride in his home. You could have ridden past yesterday, most people would have, but you stopped, and you helped us, and you're continuing to help us, even though it could bring you trouble. Luke was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. My father used to say that a man's character isn't measured by what he does when people are watching, but by what he does when no one would ever know the difference. Yesterday, finding you and Samuel. There wasn't anyone around to see what I did or didn't do, but I'd have to live with whatever choice I made for the rest of my life. And this choice, taking us in, protecting us, you can live with that? Luke smiled slightly, the first real smile Clara had seen from him. Yes, ma'am, I can live with that just fine. As they settled in for their second night in the cabin, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate, frantic hope of escape, but the quieter, steadier hope that came from finding unexpected kindness in the world. Samuel was healthy and safe. She was warm and fed and protected, and for the first time since her parents' death, she wasn't facing the future alone. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pine trees, but inside the cabin all was warm and peaceful. Clara listened to the steady rhythm of Luke's breathing from his bedroll by the fire and allowed herself to believe, just for this moment, that they had found sanctuary. But even as sleep took her, a part of her mind remained alert, listening for the sound of horses in the distance, knowing that Roy Duval was not the kind of man to simply let her disappear. Their respite was temporary, and soon enough, they would have to face whatever came next. For now, though, they were safe, and that was enough. The third morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the snow-covered landscape look like something from a child's picture book. Luke was outside splitting wood when he heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching up the trail. He paused, axe in hand, listening to the rhythm of the horse's gait. Single rider, moving at a steady pace but not in any particular hurry. That eliminated his first worry. Roy Duval's men would likely travel in a group and with more urgency. Luke set down the axe and walked to the corner of the cabin where he could get a clear view of the approaching rider. Even at a distance, he recognized the familiar figure of May Hargrove, sitting her sturdy bay mare with the easy confidence of someone who'd been born in the saddle. May ran a small restaurant and boarding house in Bitterroot Creek, the town that sat in the valley 15 miles southeast of Luke's ranch. She was also one of the few people Luke considered a genuine friend. May was a woman of perhaps 45 years, with graying brown hair that she kept pinned back in a practical bun and sharp green eyes that missed very little of what went on around her. She'd come west with her husband 20 years earlier, full of dreams about building a life in the territory. When cholera took Henry during the first winter, most people expected May to pack up and head back east. Instead, she'd stayed, turned their small house into a business, and made herself indispensable to the community through a combination of excellent cooking, fair dealing, and an ability to know everyone's business without being judgmental about it. Luke stepped out to meet her as she rode into the yard, noting the serious expression on her weathered face. May wasn't given to social calls, especially not in weather like this, and the early hour suggested this wasn't a pleasure visit. "Morning, May," Luke called out as she dismounted. "What brings you up the mountain?" "Luke." May secured her horse to the hitching post and turned to face him, her expression grim. "We need to talk." Before Luke could respond, the cabin door opened and Clara appeared, carrying Samuel. She'd been helping Luke with the morning chores, and her face showed the alertness of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of unexpected visitors. May's eyes took in Clara's appearance, the fading bruises, the way she held herself, the protective way she cradled the baby. Her expression softened slightly, but the worry lines around her eyes deepened. "Mrs. Duval, I presume," May said quietly. Clara stiffened at the use of her name, and Luke saw her take an instinctive step backward toward the cabin door. "How do you know who you are?" May finished. "Honey, half the territory knows who you are by now. Roy's been spreading word that his wife ran off with a baby that ain't his, and he's got 3 men with him asking questions in every town from here to Helena." Luke felt his jaw tighten. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that come with money attached," May replied grimly. "He's offering $50 to anyone who can tell him where you've gone, Clara, and twice that to anyone who brings you back." Clara's face went pale, and Luke saw her sway slightly on her feet. He moved quickly to her side, his hand steadying her elbow. "Come inside," he said. "All of us, May. You'll want coffee and something to eat. It's a long ride up here." Inside the cabin, the 3 adults settled around Luke's small table while Samuel dozed peacefully in Clara's arms. May accepted a cup of coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm tin cup in a gesture that reminded Luke of Clara's first morning in his home. "Tell me everything," Luke said without preamble. May took a sip of coffee and set the cup down with deliberate care. "Roy rode into town yesterday afternoon with 3 men I didn't recognize. Hard-looking types. The kind you hire when you need work done that decent folks won't do. They went straight to the sheriff's office." "Sheriff Morrison?" Luke asked. "That's the problem, Luke. Morrison's out of town. Went to Helena on some territorial business and won't be back for a week, maybe more. The man Roy talked to was Deputy Hartwell." Luke cursed under his breath. Pete Hartwell was young, inexperienced, and easily impressed by men with money and authority. He was also, Luke suspected, not above taking payment for looking the other way when it suited him. What did Roy tell him? Spun quite a tale, May said, her voice dry. According to Roy, Clara here is his lawfully wedded wife who stole valuable family jewelry when she ran off. Said she took the baby to try to make him feel guilty about pursuing her, playing on his supposed affection for the child. Clara made a small sound of distress. That's not true. I didn't take anything except the clothes on my back and what little food I could carry for Samuel. I know that, honey, May said gently. Anyone with eyes can see what kind of man Roy Duval is. But Hartwell's young and stupid, and Roy's got money and influence. The deputy issued a warrant for your arrest on charges of theft and kidnapping. Kidnapping her own child? Luke's voice was incredulous. According to Roy, the baby isn't legally hers since she bore him during her marriage to Roy. Claims it makes the child his property under territorial law, and that taking him constitutes kidnapping. May's expression showed exactly what she thought of such legal maneuvering. Luke stood abruptly and began pacing the small confines of the cabin. What else did Roy say? He's got those 3 men of his spreading out to search the surrounding areas. Told them to check every ranch, every line shack, every place someone might take shelter. He's also posted notices in town offering the reward money. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. How long before they get here? May considered the question carefully. Depends on how systematic they are about it. If they're checking every property between here and town, could be today, could be tomorrow. But Luke, there's something else you need to know. Luke stopped pacing and looked at her. Roy's been telling people that whoever's hiding Clara is interfering with a lawful marriage and helping a criminal evade justice. He's suggesting that anyone who helps her could be charged as an accessory. May paused, studying Luke's face. He specifically mentioned that he'd heard Clara might have headed up into the mountains, and that any rancher who took her in would find himself on the wrong side of the law. The implication was clear. Roy suspected that Clara had found help, and he was doing everything he could to make harboring her as costly as possible for whoever was providing that help. Luke sat back down at the table, his mind working through the possibilities. May, what's the feeling in town? Are people buying Roy's story? Mixed, May admitted. Some folks remember Clara from before her marriage. Remember what a sweet girl she was. They know Roy's reputation too. He's not well liked, and people have noticed the way Clara looked whenever she came to town with him. But others? She shrugged. Others figure it's not their business, and $50 is a lot of money to most folks around here. Clara had been listening to this exchange with growing despair. Mr. Carver, she said quietly, you have to let me go. I can't let you get in trouble because of me. I'll take Samuel and keep moving. Maybe we can make it to Helena, or even further west. In this weather? Luke's voice was sharp. With a baby? Clara, you wouldn't last 2 days out there. Then what are we supposed to do? Clara's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. I won't go back to Roy. I won't let him take Samuel. But I can't ask you to risk everything for us. May leaned forward and placed a gentle hand on Clara's arm. Honey, there might be another way. Both Luke and Clara looked at her expectantly. The warrant Hartwell issued, it's questionable at best. Sheriff Morrison's a fair man, and he knows territorial law better than his deputy. If we could get word to him in Helena, explain the real situation, he might be able to straighten things out legally. That's a big might, Luke pointed out, and it doesn't solve the immediate problem of Roy and his men. No, May agreed, but it gives us something to work toward. She turned back to Clara. There's also the matter of your marriage to Roy. Was there any coercion involved? Any witnesses who might testify that you didn't enter into it willingly? Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The judge who performed the ceremony, Judge Thornton, he and Roy had business dealings. I tried to tell him I didn't want to marry Roy, but he said it was for my own good, that a woman in my position needed a husband's protection. She laughed bitterly. Some protection. Judge Thornton's been known to take payments for favorable rulings, May said carefully. If we could prove that, it might invalidate the marriage entirely. Luke was studying the fire, his mind working through the logistics of what May was suggesting. All of that takes time, he said finally. And right now, time is what we don't have. He stood and walked to the window, peering out at the peaceful morning landscape. In the distance, he could see his cattle moving slowly through the snow, searching for grass. Everything looked normal, but he knew that normalcy was an illusion that could shatter at any moment. May, how much time do you think we have before Roy's men get here? Hard to say. They were planning to start searching this morning, and there are maybe a dozen ranches they'll check before they get to yours. If they're thorough, that could buy us until tomorrow evening. Maybe longer if the weather turns bad again. Luke made a decision. Clara, I want you to pack what you can carry, just the essentials for you and Samuel. Clara's face went white. You're sending us away. No, Luke said firmly, turning from the window to face her. I'm getting you somewhere safer. There's an old line shack about 5 miles north of here, up in the pine timber. It's hidden, defensible, and stocked with enough supplies to last a week or more. If Roy's men do show up here, they won't find anything. And what about you? Clara asked. Luke's smile was grim. I'll be here to greet them. Just a lonely rancher going about his business. Never seen hide nor hair of a runaway wife and baby. May nodded approvingly. That could work. But Luke, you need to be careful how you play it. Roy's no fool. And those men he's hired aren't either. If they suspect you're lying, let me worry about that, Luke said. He was already moving around the cabin, gathering supplies. May, can you ride with Clara and Samuel to the line shack? Help her get settled? Of course. Clara stood slowly, still holding Samuel. Mr. Carver, I still don't understand why you're doing this for us. You barely know us, and now you're risking your freedom, maybe your life. Luke paused in his preparations and looked at her directly. Clara, some things are right and some things are wrong. What Roy did to you, what he's still trying to do, that's wrong. Helping you and Samuel, protecting you from him, that's right. Sometimes it really is that simple. May watched this exchange with interest, noting the way Clara's expression softened as she looked at Luke. The protective stance he unconsciously took when talking about Roy's threat to her safety. All right then, May said briskly, standing and brushing crumbs from her skirt. Let's get moving. Daylight's burning, and we've got work to do. As they prepared to leave, Luke took Clara aside. There's something I want you to have, he said, pulling a small knife from his belt. It was a hunting knife, sharp and well-maintained, with a leather sheath that looked like it had seen years of use. I can't take your knife, Clara protested. It's not for everyday use, Luke said seriously. It's in case something happens to me and Roy finds you anyway. I won't see you go back to him defenseless. Clara looked down at the knife, understanding the gravity of what he was offering. Mr. Carver, Luke, promise me something. What's that? Promise me that if Roy comes here, you won't do anything foolish. You don't owe us your life. Luke was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I promise I'll be careful. It wasn't quite the promise Clara had been hoping for, but she could see it was all she was going to get. Within an hour, May and Clara were mounted and ready to go. Samuel bundled securely in Clara's arms. Luke had given them detailed directions to the line shack and enough supplies to last several days. As they prepared to ride out, he caught May's eye. "Keep them safe," he said quietly. "I will," May promised. "And Luke, don't try to be a hero. No, Roy Duval isn't worth dying over." Luke watched them disappear into the pine forest, then returned to his cabin to wait. He checked his weapons, rifle, shotgun, and pistol, and made sure they were loaded and easily accessible. Then he settled into his normal routine, feeding the cattle, checking the barn, splitting more wood. If Roy's men came, they would find nothing more than a rancher going about his daily business. But underneath the routine, Luke's senses remained alert, listening for the sound of approaching horses, preparing for whatever confrontation might come. He'd meant what he'd told Clara. Some things were right and some things were wrong, and he was prepared to stand by that principle regardless of the consequences. The morning passed quietly, but Luke knew that quiet was deceptive. Somewhere out there, dangerous men were searching for Clara and Samuel, and sooner or later, that search would lead them here. When it did, Luke would be ready. The storm began building just after noon, starting as a thin line of dark clouds on the western horizon that gradually spread across the sky like spilled ink on blotting paper. Luke watched its approach from the cabin window, noting the way the wind began to shift and intensify, carrying with it the metallic smell of snow. By mid-afternoon, the first fat flakes were falling, and by evening the world outside had disappeared into a wall of white that reduced visibility to mere feet. Luke found himself torn between gratitude for the storm's protective cover and worry about Clara and Samuel in the line shack. May knew the country well and was an experienced rider, but even she would be challenged by weather like this. He comforted himself with the knowledge that the line shack was well built and well supplied, designed to shelter men and animals through the worst that Montana winter could offer, as darkness fell and the storm continued to intensify. Luke settled into his evening routine with deliberate normalcy. He fed the fire, prepared a simple supper, and tried to read from a month-old newspaper that May had brought him from town. But concentration proved difficult. Every sound the wind made against the cabin walls caused him to look up, listening for sounds that might not belong to the storm. It was just past 8 o'clock when he heard them. At first, he thought it might be his imagination. The storm was loud enough to mask all sorts of sounds, and a man's mind could play tricks when he was expecting trouble. But then he heard it again. The distinctive sound of horses moving through snow, the creak of leather, and the muffled voices of men trying to communicate over the wind. Luke moved quickly to extinguish the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the flickering light of the fire. He retrieved his rifle from where it leaned against the wall near the door and positioned himself at the window, where he could observe the yard without being easily seen. Through the driving snow, he could make out the dim shapes of 3 riders moving slowly across his property. They stayed close together, clearly struggling with the visibility and the increasingly treacherous footing. Luke watched as they approached the barn first, one of them dismounting to check inside while the other 2 remained mounted, their hands resting conspicuously on their weapons, finding the barn empty of anything suspicious. They turned their attention to the cabin. Luke could see them more clearly now as they drew closer to the circle of light cast by his windows. 3 men, just as May had described, all wearing heavy coats and hats pulled low against the storm. Their horses were good quality animals, well fed and well cared for, not the mounts of drifters or casual hired hands. The man in the lead was tall and broad-shouldered, sitting his horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. even in the poor light and swirling snow. Luke could see enough of his face to recognize Roy Duval from Clara's description. The other two men flanked him slightly, their posture alert and ready for trouble. Luke quickly formulated his plan. He needed to appear completely natural, like a man surprised by unexpected visitors on a stormy night. He relit the oil lamp, stirred the fire to make it blaze higher, and settled into his chair with the newspaper spread across his lap. When the knock came at his door, a heavy, authoritative pounding that demanded immediate attention, Luke took his time responding. "Hold on," he called out, making his voice sound slightly annoyed. "Storm's got everything scattered about." He opened the door as if expecting to find a neighbor seeking shelter, his expression shifting to polite surprise when he saw the three mounted men in his yard. "Evening," Luke said, raising his voice to be heard over the wind. "Terrible night to be traveling. What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Roy Duval urged his horse closer to the cabin door, close enough that Luke could see the man's face clearly in the light spilling from inside. Roy was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of soft features that suggested a life of relative comfort, but his eyes were hard and calculating. There was something in his expression, a coldness that went beyond the winter weather, that immediately put Luke on guard. "We're looking for someone," Roy said without preamble. "My wife. She ran off a few days ago, took something that belongs to me. You seen any strangers pass through recently?" Luke scratched his chin thoughtfully, playing the role of a simple rancher trying to be helpful. "Can't say I have. Storm like this, most folks would have sense enough to stay put. What's your wife look like?" "Small woman, dark hair, traveling with a baby," Roy replied. "She's not right in the head, gets confused, makes up stories. Could be dangerous if she's not taking her medicine." One of Roy's companions, a lean man with a scar running down the left side of his face, added, "We're authorized to search properties where she might be hiding. Deputy Sheriff gave us the authority." Luke nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Well, you're welcome to look around, though I can't imagine why anyone would come all the way up here. Nothing but cattle and loneliness." He gestured toward the barn and the small outbuildings. "Barn's over there, root cellars around back. Not much to see, but you're welcome to check." Roy studied Luke's face carefully, searching for any sign of deception. "Mind if we come inside? Warm up a bit before we head back out?" Luke hesitated just long enough to seem like a man considering the inconvenience, then stepped back from the door. "Sure, come on in. Got coffee on the stove if you want some." The three men dismounted and entered the cabin, bringing with them the smell of wet wool and horses. Luke noted how their eyes immediately began cataloging everything in the small space. The single set of dishes on the table, the lone chair by the fire, the unmade bed visible behind the partition. They were looking for any sign that he wasn't alone. Roy positioned himself near the center of the cabin while his two companions flanked the door. The man with the scar kept his hand resting casually on his gun belt, and Luke realized they weren't taking any chances. "A nice place you got here," Roy said, his tone conversational but his eyes continuing to search. "Live here alone?" "For the better part of 8 years now," Luke replied, pouring coffee into 3 cups. "Inherited the land from my father. It's not much, but it's mine." "Lonely life," observed the third man, who had remained silent until now. He was shorter than his companions but built like a barrel, with the kind of thick hands that suggested he was comfortable with violence. "Suits me," Luke said simply. "Always been better with cattle than people." Roy accepted the coffee but didn't drink it. "You sure you haven't seen my wife?" "Dark-haired woman, maybe 24, 25 years old. She'd be carrying a baby, probably looking pretty rough after being out in this weather." Luke shook his head. Like I said, I haven't seen anyone. If a woman with a baby had come through here, I'd have remembered. That's not something you see every day up in these parts. What about tracks? The scarred man asked. Any sign of horses or people passing through your property? With this storm, Luke gestured toward the window where snow was still falling heavily. Any tracks would be covered within an hour. Could have had a whole cavalry regiment pass through and I'd never know it. Roy set down his coffee cup without having tasted it. Mr. A Carver, Luke Carver. Mr. Carver, I should tell you that hiding my wife would be a crime. Interfering with a legal marriage, harboring a fugitive, these are serious charges, the kind that could get a man sent to territorial prison. Luke met Roy's gaze steadily. I wouldn't know anything about that, Mr. Duval. Roy Duval. Roy let the name hang in the air as if it should mean something. I own the biggest ranch in 3 counties. Got interests in the territorial government too. Not the kind of man you want to cross. I'm sure you don't, Luke agreed, but like I told you, I haven't seen your wife. If I had, I'd have told you straight off. The barrel-chested man had been examining the cabin more closely, and now he spoke up. Boss, there's women's things here. Luke's heart stopped for a moment before he realized what the man was seeing. On the small shelf near the wash basin sat Clara's hairbrush, forgotten in their hurried departure that morning. Roy's eyes sharpened immediately. What kind of women's things? Hairbrush, the man replied, picking it up and holding it out. Got long dark hair caught in it too. The cabin fell silent except for the sound of wind and snow against the walls. Luke could feel the tension ratchet up several notches as Roy examined the brush, pulling free a few strands of Clara's hair. Thought you said you lived alone, Mr. Carver, Roy said softly. Luke forced himself to remain calm, thinking quickly. Had a lady friend visit a couple weeks back. May Hargrove from down in Bitterroot Creek. Runs the boarding house there. She probably forgot that when she left. Roy studied the hair in the firelight. May Hargrove, you said? That's right. You can ask her yourself when you get back to town. I think I will, Roy said. He handed the brush to the scarred man who tucked it into his coat. Mind if we look around outside? Check your barn and outbuildings? Already told you that was fine, Luke said. Though I should warn you, this storm's getting worse. Might be better to wait until morning. We'll manage, Roy said. My wife's been out in this weather for days. Every hour we waste is another hour she could freeze to death. The 3 men filed back outside, leaving Luke alone in the cabin. He watched through the window as they made their way through the storm to search his property. They were thorough, checking every building, every possible hiding place. Luke held his breath when they approached the spot where he'd helped Clara and Samuel onto their horses that morning. But the snow had indeed covered any tracks completely. After nearly an hour, they returned to the cabin, snow-covered and obviously frustrated. Nothing, the barrel-chested man reported to Roy. Roy stood in Luke's doorway, his eyes fixed on Luke's face. Mr. Carver, I'm going to ask you one more time. Have you seen my wife? Luke met his gaze without flinching. No, sir, I have not. Roy studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but I want you to know something. If I find out you've been lying to me, if I discover you've helped Clara in any way, I'll be back. And next time, I won't be so polite about it. I understand, Luke said. I hope you do. Roy turned to his men. Let's go. We've got other places to check. Luke watched from his window as the 3 riders disappeared back into the storm, their shapes quickly swallowed by the swirling snow. Only when he was certain they were gone did he allow himself to relax slightly. But even as relief washed over him, Luke knew this was far from over. Roy suspected something, Luke could see it in the man's eyes, hear it in the way he'd made his threat. The hairbrush had been a close call, and Luke realized he needed to be more careful about eliminating any trace of Clara and Samuel's presence. More importantly, he needed to think about what came next. Roy would continue searching, and eventually, his systematic approach might lead him to the line shack where Clara and Samuel were hiding. Luke needed to get word to them, needed to make sure they were safe and had an escape plan if Roy got too close. As he banked the fire for the night, Luke found himself thinking about Clara's words from that morning. "Promise me that if Roy comes here, you won't do anything foolish. You don't owe us your life." Maybe he didn't owe them his life, but he'd made a commitment to protect them. And Luke Carver was not a man who broke his word. Whatever it took, however dangerous it became, he would keep Clara and Samuel safe from Roy Duval. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but Luke no longer saw it as an ally. Roy had proven he was willing to travel in even the worst conditions, and that made him more dangerous than Luke had anticipated. The man was determined, well armed, and clearly not bound by the normal constraints of law and decency. But Luke was determined too, and this was his territory, his land. If Roy wanted to continue this game, Luke would play it, but by his own rules. As he settled into his bedroll by the fire, Luke's hand rested on his rifle. Tomorrow, he would ride to the line shack to check on Clara and Samuel. Tonight, he would listen to the storm and plan for whatever Roy Duval might try next. The war for Clara's freedom was far from over, but the first battle had been won. Luke had looked Roy in the eye and lied convincingly, bought them precious time, and learned something valuable about his enemy. Roy Duval was dangerous, but he wasn't invincible, and Luke intended to prove it. Dawn came gray and bitter cold, with the storm finally beginning to exhaust itself after nearly 18 hours of relentless snow. Luke had spent a restless night, waking every few hours to check the windows and listen for sounds that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of wind and weather. By first light, the snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a world transformed by nearly 3 feet of fresh powder that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the pale morning sun. Luke fed his animals early, his breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air as he broke ice on the water troughs and forked hay to the cattle. Every movement was deliberate, routine, but his senses remained alert for any sign of trouble. The events of the previous evening had left him with the unshakable feeling that Roy Duval wasn't finished with him. That feeling proved prophetic when, just after 9 o'clock, he spotted riders approaching from the south. Not 3 this time, but 4, Roy and his original companions, plus a 4th man Luke didn't recognize. They moved more carefully in daylight, taking time to examine the ground, looking for tracks or other signs that might have been missed in the darkness and storm. Luke positioned himself on the cabin's small front porch, his rifle leaning casually against the wall within easy reach. He'd learned long ago that the best defense was often to appear completely unconcerned, and he maintained that facade now, sipping coffee from a tin cup as if he had nothing more pressing to worry about than the weather. Roy rode directly up to the cabin this time, his horse's hooves crunching through the snow with sharp, deliberate sounds. In daylight, Luke could see more clearly the kind of man he was dealing with. Roy Duval was well dressed in expensive winter clothing, rode a fine horse with equally fine tack, and carried himself with the arrogance of someone who was accustomed to getting his way. But there was something else in his face now, a hardness that hadn't been quite as evident the night before. "Mr. Carver," Roy said without dismounting. "Beautiful morning after such a terrible storm." "That it is," Luke agreed, maintaining his relaxed posture. "Though I'm surprised to see you gentlemen out so early. Most folks would wait for the trails to get packed down a bit." "We're motivated," Roy replied. My wife's still missing and every hour counts. He gestured to his companions. This is Frank Bellows. He's a tracker, has experience finding people who don't want to be found. The fourth man, Bellows, was lean and weathered, with the kind of pale eyes that seemed to see everything. He sat his horse slightly apart from the others, his gaze constantly moving, cataloging details. Luke recognized the type, a professional hunter, the kind of man who made his living pursuing both animals and humans. "Mr. Carver," Bellows said, his voice carrying a slight accent Luke couldn't place. "Mind if I take a look around your property in daylight? Sometimes tracks show up better when the sun hits them right." Luke shrugged. "Suit yourself. Though like I told these gentlemen last night, this storm would have covered anything that was here before." Bellows smiled thinly. "You'd be surprised what survives if you know where to look." While Bellows began his systematic examination of the area around the cabin, Roy dismounted and approached the porch. Luke remained seated, but his hand moved imperceptibly closer to his rifle. "Mr. Carver, I've been thinking about our conversation last night," Roy said conversationally. "Something's been bothering me about it." "What's that?" "Well, you said May Hargrove had visited you, left that hairbrush behind. But I know May pretty well. We do business together from time to time, and I can't quite picture her riding all the way up here in winter weather just for a social call." Luke took another sip of coffee, buying himself time to think. "May's an old friend. Sometimes she brings me news from town, picks up orders for supplies. We've known each other for years." "I'm sure you have," Roy said. "But see, here's the interesting thing. I stopped by May's place on my way out of town this morning. Had a little conversation with her about her recent travels." Luke felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, but he kept his expression neutral. "Did you now?" "I did. And according to May, she hasn't been up to your ranch in over a month. In fact, she seemed quite surprised when I mentioned that you'd said she'd visited recently." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Luke could see Roy's other two men positioning themselves strategically, one near the barn and the other at an angle that would give him a clear shot at the cabin if things went badly. "Seems like there might be some confusion about that," Luke said carefully. "Seems like it," Roy agreed. "Course, it's possible May's memory isn't what it used to be. Or maybe she's trying to protect you from getting involved in something that's none of your business." From across the yard, Bellows called out, "Mr. Duval, you might want to see this." Roy's eyes never left Luke's face. "What is it, Frank?" "Tracks," Bellows replied. "Horses, heading north toward the tree line. Been partially filled in by the storm, but they're there." Luke's heart began beating faster, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Probably mine. I rode up that way a couple days ago, checking on some cattle that wandered off." Bellows approached the porch, his pale eyes fixed on Luke. "These tracks were made by at least two horses, Mr. Carver, and one of them was carrying a light load, like maybe a woman and a baby." Roy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Now, Mr. Carver, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. Have you seen my wife?" Luke stood slowly, his hand now openly resting on his rifle. "And I'm going to tell you one more time. Mr. Duval, no, I have not." "You know what I think?" Roy said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that was somehow more threatening than shouting. "I think Clara came here, probably half frozen and desperate. I think you took her in, maybe out of some misguided sense of chivalry. And I think you've been lying to me since the moment we met." "You think whatever you want," Luke replied, "and doesn't make it true." Roy pulled his coat aside, revealing the gun on his hip. "Mr. Carver, I'm a patient man, but my patience has limits. My wife is my legal property, and anyone who interferes with that is breaking the law. Now, I can ride away from here empty-handed, or I can search every inch of your property until I find what I'm looking for. Which would you prefer? Luke's fingers tightened on his rifle. I'd prefer you get off my land. The tension in the yard ratcheted up another notch. Roy's men had their hands on their weapons, waiting for a signal from their boss. Bellows had positioned himself where he could watch both Luke and the surrounding area, his hunter's instincts clearly telling him that something was about to happen. Frank, Roy said without taking his eyes off Luke, take Wilson and check those tracks, then see where they lead. Already did, Bellows replied. They head straight into the timber toward the old mining country. There's at least 3 possible destinations up that way: an abandoned mine shaft, a trapper's cabin, and what looks like it might be a line shack. Luke felt his blood turn to ice. If they found the line shack, found Clara and Samuel. Mr. Carver, Roy said, noting the slight change in Luke's expression. You look a little pale all of a sudden. Something wrong? Before Luke could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the valley. All heads turned to see a group of riders emerging from the tree line to the east. 5 men riding hard through the snow, their horses steaming in the cold air. Luke recognized the lead rider immediately and felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly buckled his knees. Sheriff Morrison sat his horse with the easy authority of a man who'd been enforcing law in the territory for over a decade. Behind him rode Deputy Collins, whom Luke knew to be a fair and honest man, and 3 other riders Luke recognized as members of the unofficial posse Morrison sometimes called upon when he needed backup. Sheriff Morrison, Roy called out, his tone shifting immediately to one of respectful greeting. I wasn't expecting to see you back from Helena so soon. Morrison rode directly into the yard, his sharp eyes taking in the tense scene before him. He was a man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. Luke had always respected Morrison as a lawman who believed in justice over politics. Mr. Duval, Morrison said, dismounting with deliberate care. Heard you've been busy while I was away. Deputy Hartwell filled me in on the warrant he issued. Just trying to get my wife back, Sheriff, Roy replied smoothly. She's not well, needs medical attention. Morrison nodded slowly, then turned to Luke. Mr. Carver, how are you this morning? He been better, Sheriff, Luke admitted. Seems there's some confusion about whether I've been harboring fugitives. Yes, I heard about that too. Morrison's gaze shifted to Bellows and Roy's other men. Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from your weapons. There seems to be some question about the legality of that warrant, and until I get it sorted out, I don't want anyone doing anything they might regret. Roy's face darkened. Sheriff, with all due respect, I have legal authority to search for my wife. Deputy Hartwell exceeded his authority. Morrison interrupted firmly. The warrant he issued was improper in several ways, not the least of which is that it was based on charges that may not hold up under territorial law. What do you mean? Roy demanded. Morrison pulled a folded document from his coat. I mean, I've been in contact with Judge Patterson in Helena. You remember him, Roy, the territorial judge who reviews questionable local rulings? He's very interested in your marriage to Clara, particularly the circumstances under which it took place. Luke saw Roy's face go pale beneath his winter tan. Furthermore, Morrison continued, I've received a sworn statement from May Hargrove detailing what she knows about Clara's situation. Makes for interesting reading. May has no business, Roy began. May has every business protecting an abused woman. Morrison cut him off. Which brings me to why I'm here. Roy, "You're under arrest." The words hung in the cold air like a physical presence. Roy's men shifted nervously, clearly uncertain about what they should do. "On what charges?" Roy sputtered. "Assault, false imprisonment, and abuse of legal process, for starters." Morrison replied calmly. "Judge Patterson will have more to say when you see him next week." Bellows had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "Mr. Duval, maybe we should—" "Frank, shut up," Roy snapped. Then to Morrison, "Sheriff, I think you're making a serious mistake. I have influential friends." "Your influential friends are part of the problem," Morrison said. "Judge Thornton's under investigation for taking bribes, and your business partner Hartwell is no longer wearing a badge as of this morning." Luke watched this confrontation with a mixture of relief and fascination. Clearly, May had done more than just warn him about Roy's search. She'd somehow managed to contact Sheriff Morrison and set larger wheels in motion. Roy made one last desperate play. "Sheriff, my wife is mentally unstable. She's made up stories about our marriage, probably convinced May and whoever else that I've mistreated her. But the fact remains that she's legally my wife, and she's taken property that belongs to me." "You mean her son?" Morrison asked. "The child born during our marriage is legally mine under territorial law." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting point, except that according to the records I've reviewed, Clara was already carrying that child when Judge Thornton forced her to marry you. Which means Samuel was never legally yours to begin with." The fight seemed to go out of Roy all at once. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, Sheriff Morrison and his men, Luke with his rifle, even his own hired hands who were clearly having second thoughts about their employment. "This isn't over," Roy said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes, it is," Morrison replied firmly. "Frank Bellows, Wilson, Crane, I strongly suggest you gentlemen find other employment. Roy Duval won't be paying anyone's wages for a while." As Morrison's men took Roy into custody, securing his weapons and preparing him for the ride back to town, the sheriff approached Luke. "Mr. Carver, if you happen to know where Clara and her son are, I'd appreciate you letting them know they're safe now. Judge Patterson wants to see them both, but as witnesses, not fugitives." Luke nodded, hardly daring to believe it was really over. "I'll see what I can do, Sheriff." Morrison smiled slightly. "I'm sure you will. And Luke, May Hargrove says to tell you that sometimes the right thing to do is also the smart thing to do." As the sheriff's party rode away with Roy in custody, Luke stood alone in his yard, watching them disappear into the distance. The silence that followed was profound, not the tense silence of impending violence, but the peaceful quiet of a crisis finally resolved. For the first time in days, Luke allowed himself to truly relax. Clara and Samuel were safe. Roy Duval was no longer a threat, and somehow justice had prevailed in a place where it didn't always reach. Now all that remained was to ride to the line shack and bring Clara and Samuel home. As he saddled his horse for the journey through the snow-covered forest, Luke found himself thinking about the word home. For years, his cabin had been simply the place where he lived, but somehow, over the past few days, it had become something more. Soon, he hoped, it would become home for 3 people instead of just 1. March brought the first tentative signs of spring to the Montana Territory, though winter's grip remained strong in the high country where Luke's ranch nestled against the Bridger Mountains. The snow had begun its slow retreat from the lower elevations, revealing patches of brown earth that steamed gently in the warming sun. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from the cabin's eaves, dripping steadily during the day before refreezing each night into new formations. It had been nearly a month since Sheriff Morrison had taken Roy Duval into custody, and the rhythm of life at the ranch had settled into something Luke had never quite experienced before: the comfortable routine of a shared household. Clara and Samuel had returned from the line shack that same day, and what had begun as temporary refuge had gradually transformed into something that felt remarkably like home. The changes were subtle at first. Clara had insisted on contributing to the household work, despite Luke's protests that she was his guest and should rest. But Clara was not a woman who could remain idle when there was work to be done, and gradually she had taken over many of the domestic tasks that Luke had always handled himself. The cabin began to smell of fresh bread more often than burned biscuits, and Luke found himself coming in from his morning chores to the sight of laundry hanging on a line strung between two posts near the cabin. The clean clothes snapping cheerfully in the mountain breeze. Clara had also begun making small improvements to the cabin's comfort and appearance. She'd sewn new curtains from fabric that May had brought up from town. Simple white cotton that softened the harsh angles of the windows and made the interior feel more welcoming. She'd rearranged the furniture slightly, creating a more comfortable seating area near the fireplace and establishing a dedicated space for Samuel's few belongings. But perhaps the most significant change was in Clara herself. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes during those first difficult days had gradually faded, replaced by something Luke could only describe as peace. She moved through the cabin with increasing confidence, no longer starting at unexpected sounds or positioning herself near the door as if ready to flee at a moment's notice. Her laughter, when it came, was genuine and unguarded, and Luke found himself treasuring those moments when her face lit up with genuine happiness. Samuel, too, had thrived in the warmth and security of the cabin. The baby had grown noticeably in the weeks since their arrival, his cheeks filling out and his eyes becoming more alert and responsive. He'd begun to smile regularly, particularly when Luke appeared in his line of sight, and the sound of his gurgling laughter had become one of Luke's favorite parts of each day. Luke had surprised himself with how naturally he'd taken to having a baby in the house. He'd fashioned a high chair of sorts from pine boards, sanding it smooth and painting it with leftover barn paint to create a safe place for Samuel to sit during meals. He'd also carved a set of simple wooden toys, a horse, a cow, and a small train, that never failed to capture the baby's attention during fussy periods. The legal situation had resolved itself more easily than anyone had dared hope. Judge Patterson had indeed invalidated Clara's marriage to Roy Duval, ruling that it had been obtained through coercion and judicial corruption. Roy himself had been sentenced to 2 years in territorial prison for assault and abuse of legal process, while Judge Thornton had been removed from the bench and faced his own criminal charges. Clara was now legally free, her own woman for the first time since her parents' death. The relief this brought her was visible in everything she did, from the way she held her shoulders straight when she walked to the way she'd begun humming while she worked around the cabin. But beyond the practical changes, there had been something else growing between Clara and Luke, something neither of them had spoken about directly, but which colored their interactions with increasing warmth and understanding. It showed itself in small gestures, the way Clara would have coffee ready for Luke when he came in from the cold, the way Luke would automatically check on Samuel when the baby cried in the night, the way they'd begun sitting together by the fire in the evenings, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. On this particular March morning, Luke was repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by falling timber during a recent windstorm. The work was satisfying, requiring just enough concentration to keep his hands busy while allowing his mind to wander. He could hear Clara singing softly to Samuel from the cabin, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp mountain air. The song was one he remembered from his childhood, a simple ballad about a garden where flowers bloomed despite the harsh weather. His mother had sung it while she worked, and hearing it now from Clara's lips brought back memories that were both bittersweet and comforting. Mr. Carver?" Clara's voice interrupted his reverie. He looked up to see her approaching with a cup of coffee and a plate of the molasses cookies she'd baked that morning. Samuel was bundled in her arms, wide awake and observing the world with the serious expression that seemed to be his natural state. "Thought you might be ready for a break," she said, settling herself on a fallen log near where he was working. Luke accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Clara had begun to anticipate his needs without being asked. It was one of many small kindnesses that had become part of their daily routine. "I fence coming along well," Clara observed, studying his work. "He should hold through the spring runoff." Luke agreed, "Though I'll need to reinforce the posts near the creek before the water gets too high." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Luke drinking his coffee and Clara entertaining Samuel with a game that involved making faces at him until he giggled. Luke found himself watching them both, struck by how right they looked here in this setting, how natural it felt to have them as part of his daily life. "Luke," Clara said suddenly, and he noticed that she'd begun using his first name more frequently in recent weeks. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" Clara shifted Samuel to her other arm, her expression thoughtful. "I've been here for over a month now, and I know you didn't plan on having permanent house guests. I've been wondering if I should start making plans to find a place of my own." Luke felt something cold settle in his stomach at the thought of Clara and Samuel leaving. Over the past weeks, he'd grown so accustomed to their presence that the cabin felt incomplete when they weren't there. "Is that what you want?" he asked carefully. "To find your own place?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying Samuel's face as he played with the wooden horse Luke had carved for him. "I don't know," she said finally. "I've never really had the chance to make that kind of decision for myself before. When my parents died, Roy made all the choices about my future. Now, for the first time, I can decide what I want my life to look like." "And what do you think you want it to look like?" Clara looked up at him then, and Luke saw something in her eyes that made his heart beat faster. "I think," she said slowly, "I want it to look something like this. Samuel safe and happy, meaningful work to do, people I care about nearby." She paused, then added, "But I don't want to assume anything. Luke, you've been more generous than I had any right to expect, and I don't want to take advantage of your kindness." Luke set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "Clara, having you and Samuel here, it's been the best month I've had in years. This place was just a house before you came. Now it feels like a home." The words hung between them, carrying more weight than the simple statement they appeared to be. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of happiness rather than sorrow. "Do you mean that?" she asked softly. "I've never meant anything more in my life," Luke replied. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A single rider was making his way up the trail from the valley, and Luke recognized May Hargrove's familiar figure long before she came close enough to hail them. May dismounted near the cabin and walked over to where they sat, her face wearing the expression of someone who had news to share. Morning, you two," she said, accepting Luke's offer of his seat on the log. "Beautiful day for fence mending." "May," Clara said warmly, "what brings you up the mountain? Not bad news, I hope." "Just the opposite," May replied, her eyes twinkling. "Thought you'd like to know that Roy Duval's trial is over. Judge Patterson sentenced him to 3 years, not 2, and ordered him to pay restitution for the damage he caused. Also ruled that he has no legal claim whatsoever to Samuel." Clara's relief was visible. "So it's really over?" "It's really over," May confirmed. "You're free to live your life however you choose, Clara. No one can interfere with that." Luke felt a surge of satisfaction at the news. though he'd never doubted that justice would ultimately prevail. Still, having it confirmed officially removed the last shadow of uncertainty that had been hanging over them. "There's something else, too," May continued, reaching into her coat and pulling out an envelope. "Letter came for you, Luke, from your brother in California." Luke accepted the letter with surprise. He and Benjamin corresponded perhaps twice a year, and they'd exchanged letters only a few months earlier. "Mind if I read it now?" he asked. "Of course not," May said, "though I suspect I know what it says." Luke broke the seal and unfolded the letter, scanning the familiar handwriting quickly. As he read, his expression grew thoughtful, then concerned. "What is it?" Clara asked, noting his expression. Luke looked up from the letter. "Benjamin's wife has taken ill. Something serious from the sound of it. He's asking if I might consider coming to California to help with the children while she recovers." Clara felt her heart sink. After their conversation about the future, the timing of this request seemed particularly cruel. "When would you need to leave?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "He says as soon as possible," Luke replied. "The journey would take several weeks, and if his wife's condition is as serious as he suggests, I might need to stay for months." May watched this exchange with interest, noting the careful way both Luke and Clara were trying to hide their disappointment. "Course," May said casually. "It might be difficult to leave the ranch unattended for that long. Place needs daily care, especially during spring calving season." Luke nodded, clearly torn between his obligation to his brother and his reluctance to leave Clara and Samuel. "That's true. And I'd hate to abandon the cattle just when they need the most attention. Seems to me," May continued, "you'd need someone you trust completely to look after things while you're gone. Someone who knows the routine, cares about the place, and has a stake in keeping it running properly." Clara caught the direction of May's thoughts and felt her cheeks warm. "May, I couldn't possibly—" "Why not?" May interrupted. "You've been helping Luke run this place for a month now. You know the daily routine better than anyone. And Samuel's certainly made himself at home here." Luke looked at Clara with growing excitement. "May's right. If you were willing to stay and manage things while I'm gone, I wouldn't have to worry about the ranch or the cattle. But Clara, that would be asking a lot of you." "It would also give me something I've never had before," Clara said quietly. "A real purpose, a real responsibility, and a place that's truly mine, at least temporarily." Luke stood up and began pacing, his mind working through the possibilities. "The cattle are due to start calving in a few weeks. You'd need to check on them daily, help with difficult births, make sure they have adequate feed and water. It's hard work, especially for someone who's never done it before." "Then teach me," Clara said simply. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Luke, and I learn quickly." May smiled with satisfaction. "Sounds like you two have found a solution. Clara gets to prove she can manage on her own. Luke gets to help his brother when he needs it, and the ranch gets proper care. Everybody wins." Over the next several hours, they discussed the practical details of the arrangement. Luke would spend the remaining weeks before his departure teaching Clara everything she needed to know about managing the ranch. May would check on her regularly and provide assistance if needed. And when Luke returned from California, they would reassess the situation and decide what came next. As the day wore on and the plan took shape, Luke found himself feeling increasingly optimistic about the arrangement. It would give Clara the independence she craved while allowing her to discover whether ranch life truly suited her. And it would give him time to think about his own feelings, to decide whether the affection he felt for Clara was the kind of love that could sustain a lifetime partnership. That evening, as they sat by the fire with Samuel sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms, Luke found himself studying her face in the flickering light. She looked content, he realized, in a way he'd never seen before. Not just safe or comfortable, but genuinely happy. "Clara," he said quietly, "are you sure about this? Managing the ranch alone is a big responsibility." Clara looked down at Samuel, then back at Luke. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "For the first time in my life, I have the chance to prove what I'm capable of. I won't waste that opportunity." Luke nodded, satisfied with her answer. As he banked the fire for the night, he found himself thinking about the future with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Whatever came next, whatever decisions they ultimately made about their lives. He knew that Clara would face them with the same courage and determination she'd shown throughout their ordeal, and for the first time since receiving his brother's letter. Luke began to look forward to his return from California, eager to see what Clara would accomplish in his absence, and excited about the conversation they would have when he came home. The word home echoed in his mind as he settled into his bedroll by the fire. Yes, he thought drowsily. That's exactly what this place had become, not just his home, but theirs. And when he returned from California, he intended to make that arrangement permanent. Luke returned from California on a warm afternoon in late June, when the wildflowers were painting the mountain meadows in brilliant splashes of purple, yellow, and red. The journey had taken him away for nearly 3 months, longer than either he or Clara had anticipated. But his brother's wife had suffered complications that required extended care. Now, as he rode Rusty up the familiar trail toward home, Luke felt his heart beating faster with each mile. The ranch looked better than he had dared hope. The fences were in perfect repair. The cattle were fat and healthy in the summer pastures. And the vegetable garden that Clara had planted near the cabin was flourishing with neat rows of potatoes, beans, and corn. Smoke rose lazily from the cabin chimney, and he could see laundry hanging on the line, snapping gently in the afternoon breeze. As he approached the cabin, Clara emerged from the barn carrying a milk pail, with Samuel toddling beside her on unsteady legs. Luke's breath caught at the sight of them. Clara looked radiant in the summer sunshine, her dark hair caught back in a practical braid, her face glowing with health and contentment. Samuel had grown remarkably during Luke's absence. He was walking now, chattering in the incomprehensible language of toddlers, and clearly thriving in the mountain air. "Luke," Clara called out when she spotted him, her face lighting up with a joy that made Luke's chest tighten with emotion. She set down the milk pail and scooped up Samuel, who had spotted Luke and was babbling excitedly. Luke dismounted and found himself suddenly uncertain, despite having imagined this moment countless times during his journey home. 3 months was a long time, and he wondered if the feelings that had been growing between them before his departure had survived the separation. His uncertainty lasted only until Clara reached him. Without hesitation, she threw her free arm around him in a warm embrace that spoke of genuine affection and relief at his safe return. "Welcome home," she said softly, and the word home in her voice carried all the meaning Luke had hoped it would. "You good to be back," Luke replied, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, the clean smell of soap and sunshine that had haunted his dreams for months. He reached out to ruffle Samuel's hair, and the boy grinned at him with recognition and delight. "How was the journey? How is your brother's wife?" Clara asked as they walked toward the cabin together. Better, thank God. The fever finally broke last month and she's regaining her strength. Benjamin's family is out of danger now." Luke looked around at the ranch with amazement. "Clara, this place looks incredible. You've done more in 3 months than I usually accomplish in a year." Clara flushed with pleasure at his praise. "I had good teachers," she said. "May checked on us every week, and your neighbor Tom Fletcher helped me with the more difficult cattle work. But mostly, I just followed the routine you taught me. That evening, after Samuel had been fed and put to bed, Luke and Clara sat on the cabin's small porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air was warm and still, filled with the scent of pine and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pastures. Luke had brought gifts from California, a bolt of fine fabric for Clara, wooden blocks carved with letters for Samuel, and coffee beans that were better than anything available in Montana territory. But more than the gifts, he had brought stories of his time away, and Clara listened with fascination as he described the bustling cities, the ocean that stretched to the horizon, and the orange groves that perfumed the air with their blossoms. "It sounds wonderful," Clara said when he finished. "Did you ever think about staying? California seems to offer so many opportunities." Luke was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. During his time in California, Benjamin had indeed suggested that Luke consider relocating permanently. There were opportunities there for a man with his skills, and the climate was more forgiving than Montana's harsh winters. "I thought about it," Luke admitted. Benjamin made a compelling case for the advantages of California living, but every time I considered it seriously, I realized that everything I truly wanted was here. He turned to look at Clara as he spoke, and she felt her heart skip at the intensity in his eyes. "Clara," Luke continued, his voice growing serious, "while I was away, I had a lot of time to think about what I want my life to look like, about what really matters to me." Clara set down her coffee cup, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere significant. "I realized that this ranch, this land, it's not really home without the right people to share it with. A house is just a building until it's filled with the people you love." The word love hung in the evening air between them, and Clara felt her breath catch. "Luke," she said softly, "what are you saying?" Luke stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the land he'd inherited from his father, the mountains that had sheltered him through good times and bad. When he turned back to Clara, his expression was resolute but gentle. "I'm saying that I love you, Clara. I love Samuel as if he were my own son. I love the life we built together before I left, and I love the way you've cared for this place while I was gone." He paused, then continued quietly. "I'm saying that I want you to stay, not as my guest, not as someone helping me temporarily, but as my wife." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of happiness rather than sorrow. She had hoped for this moment, dreamed of it during the long nights when she'd wondered if Luke's feelings for her were as strong as hers for him. "Luke," she whispered, "I love you too. I have for months, but I was afraid to say it, afraid to assume that you felt the same way." Luke returned to his chair and took her hands in his. "I don't have a ring to offer you," he said. "I don't have much of anything except this ranch and my promise to love and protect you and Samuel for the rest of my life." Clara laughed through her tears. "I don't need a ring, Luke. I need exactly what you're offering, a home, a family, a future built together. Then you'll marry me?" "Yes," Clara said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." Luke reached into his saddlebags, which sat beside his chair, and withdrew a carefully wrapped bundle. "I do have something for you," he said, unfolding the fabric to reveal a beautiful shawl woven from soft wool in earth tones that reminded Clara of the Montana landscape. "I had this made by a weaver in California," Luke explained as he settled the shawl around Clara's shoulders. "She used wool from sheep that graze in the mountains, and she wove in patterns that represent the peaks and valleys. I hoped it might remind you that you belong here in this place with me." Clara touched the intricate weaving with reverent fingers. The shawl was beautiful, but more than that, it represented Luke's intention to make her a permanent part of his life, his commitment to their future together. "It's perfect," she said, pulling the shawl closer around her shoulders. "It feels like being embraced by the mountains themselves." They sat together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, both of them savoring the moment and the promise it represented. Luke's hand found Clara's, and their fingers intertwined naturally, as if they had been meant to fit together. "When should we have the ceremony?" Clara asked eventually. "Whenever you want," Luke replied. "Could tomorrow, next month, next year, it doesn't matter to me as long as you're sure this is what you want." Clara considered the question thoughtfully. "I'd like May to be there, of course. And I'd like Samuel to be old enough to have some memory of the day, even if it's just a vague one. We could wait until late summer," Luke suggested. "August, perhaps. That would give us time to plan properly, and the weather should be good for traveling." "August sounds perfect," Clara agreed, as they continued to talk about their plans, making decisions about the ceremony and their life together. Luke found himself marveling at how right everything felt. There was no awkwardness, no uncertainty. Just the comfortable certainty of two people who had found their place in the world together. "Luke," Clara said as they prepared to go inside for the night, "I want you to know something. I never believed I would have this, a real choice about who to marry, a man who loves me for who I am rather than what I can provide. You've given me something I thought was impossible." Luke cupped her face gently in his hands. "You've given me something I didn't even know I was missing," he replied. "Purpose, companionship, love, all the things that make a life worth living." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative at first, then deeper as they both acknowledged the feelings they had been holding back for months. When they finally separated, both were breathless. "I should go check on Samuel," Clara murmured, though she made no move to step away from Luke's embrace. "He's fine," Luke said softly. "But yes, we should probably get some rest. Tomorrow I want to hear everything that happened while I was away. Every detail of how you managed the ranch, every challenge you faced, every decision you made." As they made their way inside, Clara carrying the oil lamp while Luke banked the fire, both felt the profound satisfaction of a decision well made. The uncertainty that had marked their relationship for months had been replaced by the solid foundation of mutual love and commitment. Luke settled into his familiar bedroll by the fireplace while Clara retired to the partitioned area with Samuel. But now their separation felt temporary rather than permanent, a matter of propriety rather than uncertainty about their feelings. "Good night, Clara," Luke called softly. "Good night, Luke," she replied, then after a pause, she added, "I love you." "I love you too," Luke said, and felt the truth of those words settle into his bones like warmth from the fire. As he lay listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin at night, the settling of timber, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the soft breathing of the woman and child who had become his family, Luke felt a contentment deeper than any he had ever known. Tomorrow would bring the practical details of planning a wedding and merging their lives officially. There would be decisions to make about the ranch, about Samuel's future, about the 1,000 small details that made up a shared life. But tonight, there was only the simple joy of having found each other, of having chosen love over fear, of having built something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of tragedy and loss. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of autumn harvests and winter storms to come. But inside the cabin, all was warmth and peace and the quiet certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The proposal was complete, the promises made, and the future stretched before them bright with possibility. In the morning, they would begin planning their wedding. Tonight, They would dream of the life they would build together in the shadow of the mountains that had brought them home to each other. The summer of 1882 painted the Montana Territory in shades of gold and green that seemed to stretch endlessly under a sky so blue it made the heart ache with its beauty. Luke and Clara's wedding had taken place in late August, a simple ceremony conducted by Sheriff Morrison in the wildflower meadow behind their cabin, with May Hargrove standing as Clara's witness and Tom Fletcher serving as Luke's best man. Samuel, now nearly 2 years old and walking with the confident swagger of a child who knew he was loved, had toddled between the adults throughout the ceremony, occasionally stopping to examine interesting rocks or chase butterflies. Now, as autumn approached with its promise of harvest and preparation for another Montana winter, the Carver Ranch had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a well-established household. Clara had officially become Clara Carver, and Samuel bore Luke's name as well, legally adopted through the territorial courts with papers that ensured no one could ever again question his place in the family. The cabin itself had grown to accommodate their expanding life. Luke had spent the early weeks of their marriage building an addition that included a proper bedroom for him and Clara, a small room for Samuel, and a larger kitchen area that could handle the increased cooking and food preservation that came with feeding a family and the occasional travelers who stopped seeking shelter and sustenance. It was these travelers who had gradually transformed the Carver Ranch from a simple cattle operation into something approaching a way station for those crossing the challenging terrain between the mining camps to the north and the settlements to the south. Word had spread through the informal network that existed among people who lived on the edges of civilization that Luke and Clara Carver could be counted on for a warm meal, a safe place to sleep, and help with whatever troubles might have driven them into the wilderness. On this particular October morning, Clara stood in her kitchen. She still marveled at being able to think of any space as truly hers, kneading bread while Samuel played on the floor with the wooden animals Luke had carved for him. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and apples from the preserves she'd been making, and steam rose from the large pot where she was preparing soup for the evening meal. The routine of preserving food for winter had become one of Clara's favorite parts of ranch life. There was something deeply satisfying about the shelves lined with jars of vegetables, fruits, and meats that would sustain them through the months when the outside world became inaccessible. Luke had taught her the skills his mother had passed down to him, and Clara had added techniques she remembered from her own childhood, creating a household system that was both efficient and comforting. Luke entered the kitchen from the barn, bringing with him the smell of hay and horses and the crisp autumn air that promised the first snow wasn't far off. At 33, he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in the world, and Clara felt the familiar flutter of happiness she always experienced when he appeared. "Our coffee smells good," Luke said, kissing Clara's cheek as he passed her to wash his hands in the basin near the window. "A fresh pot," Clara replied, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. "How are the cattle looking?" "Fat and ready for winter," Luke said with satisfaction. "The new bull from the Henderson Ranch has settled in well, and I count at least 15 cows that should calve come spring." Samuel looked up from his toys at the sound of Luke's voice and immediately launched into an enthusiastic description of his morning activities, delivered in the mixture of real words and toddler language that only his parents could fully understand. "He helped me collect eggs this morning," Clara translated when Samuel paused for breath. "And he's very proud that he only dropped one." Luke crouched down to Samuel's level and examined the wooden horse the boy was holding. "This fellow looks like he's been working hard," Luke said seriously. "Maybe he needs some oats." Samuel giggled and pretended to feed the wooden horse, a game that never failed to delight him. Watching them together, Clara felt the deep contentment that had become the dominant emotion of her daily life. Samuel adored Luke with the uncomplicated devotion of a child who had never known anything but kindness from his father figure. And Luke's love for the boy was equally apparent in every interaction. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention, and Luke moved to the window to see who was coming. Clara had learned to recognize the different sounds, the steady pace of neighbors, the more urgent rhythm of someone in trouble, the multiple hoofbeats that might mean anything from a family traveling together to something more dangerous. "3 riders," Luke reported. "Look like they're having trouble with one of their horses." Clara automatically began preparing for guests, setting out additional bowls and checking the coffee supply. Over the months, they had developed an efficient system for handling unexpected visitors. Born from experience with travelers who might arrive at any hour in any condition, Luke stepped onto the porch to greet the newcomers, and Clara could hear the murmur of voices as he offered assistance. When he returned to the kitchen a few minutes later, he was accompanied by a woman of perhaps 45 years, a teenage boy who was clearly her son, and a man who appeared to be her husband. "Clara," Luke said, "I'd like you to meet the Patterson family. They're heading south to Helena, but their pack horse has gone lame. I told them they're welcome to rest here while we take a look at the animal." The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret Patterson, looked exhausted in the way that spoke of more than just physical fatigue. Her clothes were travel-worn but well-made, and Clara noticed that her hands shook slightly as she accepted the offered cup of coffee. "Mrs. Carver," Margaret said, "I can't tell you how grateful we are. We've been traveling for 2 weeks, and this is the first kindness we've encountered." Clara settled the family at the kitchen table while Luke went to examine their horse. Samuel, who was usually shy with strangers, seemed drawn to the teenage boy, whose name was David. Soon the two were engaged in a serious discussion about wooden animals, with David showing impressive patience for Samuel's limited vocabulary. As Margaret Patterson relaxed in the warmth of the kitchen, her story began to emerge. Her husband had been a mine foreman near Virginia City, but an accident had left him partially disabled. Unable to continue his work, they had decided to try their luck in Helena, where Margaret's sister lived and where they hoped to establish a small business. "We had saved some money," Margaret explained, "but the journey has taken longer than we expected, and our supplies are running low. When the horse went lame this morning, I thought—" She trailed off, but Clara could see the fear in her eyes, the terror of being stranded in the wilderness with winter approaching. "You're safe here," Clara said firmly. "We'll make sure your horse is properly cared for, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need to." Luke returned from examining the horse with good news. The lameness was caused by a stone bruise that would heal with rest, but the animal would need several days to recover before it could safely carry a pack. "Several days?" Margaret's husband, William, looked worried. "We can't afford to impose on your hospitality for that long." "It's not an imposition," Luke said. "We have the space, and there's always work to be done around a ranch. If you're willing to help with some chores, we'll call it an even trade." Clara watched this exchange with the pride she always felt when Luke demonstrated the fundamental decency that made him the man she'd fallen in love with. He never turned away anyone in genuine need, never made their guests feel like burdens, and always found a way to preserve their dignity while offering help. Over the next several days, the Patterson family became part of the ranch's daily routine. William, despite his limitations, proved useful for tasks that didn't require heavy lifting, and David threw himself into ranch work with the enthusiasm of a boy eager to prove himself a man. Margaret helped Clara with the endless tasks of food preparation and preservation, and the two women found they enjoyed each other's company. But it was in the evenings, when the work was done and they all gathered around the fireplace, that Clara felt most clearly how their home had become something larger than just a place where she and Luke and Samuel lived. The cabin filled with conversation, laughter, and the kind of easy camaraderie that developed among people who shared both work and shelter. Margaret proved to be an accomplished storyteller, regaling them with tales from her years in the mining camps, while William had a gift for fixing things that seemed beyond repair, a skill that made him invaluable around a ranch where equipment was expensive and hard to replace. David taught Samuel new games and helped him improve his vocabulary, while Luke shared his knowledge of the territory and its challenges with people who would soon be traveling through unfamiliar country. On their last evening before departing for Helena, Margaret pulled Clara aside as they cleaned up after supper. "Mrs. Carver," she said quietly, "I want you to know that what you and your husband have done for us, it's more than hospitality. You've restored our faith that there are still good people in the world." Clara felt tears threaten at the sincerity in Margaret's voice. "You would have done the same for us," she said. "I hope I would have," Margaret replied, "but I know that many people wouldn't. What you've built here, this home, this sanctuary, it's something special. I hope you know that." The next morning, as the Patterson family prepared to continue their journey with their recovered horse and replenished supplies, Clara stood on the porch holding Samuel and watching Luke make final adjustments to their pack. The scene had been repeated many times over the months, and each departure left her with mixed feelings, sadness at seeing friends leave, but satisfaction at knowing they were better equipped to face whatever lay ahead. "Will we see them again?" Samuel asked, waving enthusiastically at David, who had become his particular friend during their stay. "Maybe," Clara said. "The territory's smaller than it seems sometimes. People have a way of crossing paths again when you least expect it." Luke joined them on the porch as the Patterson family rode away, their voices calling back thanks and promises to write when they reached Helena safely. "Good people," Luke said, settling his arm around Clara's waist. "They are," Clara agreed. "It's been nice having them here." Luke looked down at her with a slight smile. "You don't mind? The way we seem to collect strays and travelers?" Clara considered the question seriously. Over the months, their home had sheltered families like the Pattersons, lone prospectors down on their luck, cowboys between jobs, and even a traveling minister who had stayed for a week while recovering from pneumonia. Each guest had brought their own stories, their own challenges, and their own contributions to the life of the ranch. "I love it," she said finally. "I love that we can be the place where people find help when they need it. I love that Samuel is growing up seeing kindness as normal, expected behavior. And I love that we're building something here that's bigger than just the three of us." Luke tightened his arm around her. "Even when it means extra work, extra worry, extra expense?" "Especially then," Clara said firmly. "Anyone can be generous when it's easy. What matters is what you do when it costs you something." That afternoon, as Clara worked in her garden harvesting the last of the season's vegetables, she reflected on the conversation with Luke. The life they had built together was indeed larger than she could have imagined when she first arrived at his cabin, half frozen and desperate. They had created not just a home, but a refuge, a place where the fundamental human values of kindness, generosity, and mutual aid could flourish even in the harsh environment of the Montana wilderness. Samuel played nearby, chattering to himself as he helped by pulling up carrots and placing them carefully in the basket Clara had given him. At 3 years old, he was developing into a confident, curious child who took for granted that the world was a place where strangers became friends, where there was always room at the table for one more, and where his parents could be counted on to do the right thing even when it wasn't easy. As evening approached and Luke returned from checking the cattle, Clara gathered up their harvest and headed for the cabin. The kitchen would soon fill with the warm smells of supper, The fire would be lit against the growing chill, and they would settle into their evening routine of quiet conversation and shared tasks. Later, as they sat by the fire with Samuel sleeping peacefully in Luke's lap, Clara found herself thinking about the letter that had arrived that morning with the Patterson family. May had written from town with news that Roy Duval had been released from prison but had left the territory entirely, reportedly heading for Oregon where he had distant relatives. The news should have troubled her, Clara supposed, but instead she felt only a detached kind of satisfaction. Roy belonged to a different life, a different version of herself that no longer existed. The woman who had been tied to that fence post in the blizzard, terrified and desperate, had been transformed by love and purpose into someone Roy could no longer touch or harm. "What are you thinking about?" Luke asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "How far we've come," Clara said simply. "All of us. Not just in distance, but in becoming the people we were meant to be." Luke looked down at Samuel, then back at Clara. "Do you ever miss it? The life you might have had if things had been different?" Clara considered the question carefully. "I miss my parents sometimes. I wonder what they would think of the life I've chosen, whether they would approve of Samuel growing up so far from civilization and schools and churches. And?" Clara smiled. "And then I look at Samuel, see how happy he is, how confident and kind and curious about the world. I look at what we've built here, the good we've been able to do for people who needed help, and I think my parents would be proud." As they prepared for bed that night, going through the familiar routine of banking the fire and checking the doors, Clara felt the deep satisfaction that came from a day well lived, a life well chosen. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new travelers perhaps, new opportunities to demonstrate that even in the wilderness, especially in the wilderness, civilization was what people made of it. The Montana wind whispered around the cabin, carrying with it the scent of snow from the high peaks and the promise of another winter to test their preparations and their resolve. But inside, all was warmth and peace and the quiet certainty that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together. In the wilderness that had once seemed so hostile and unforgiving, Luke and Clara had created something remarkable, not just a home, but a beacon of hope for anyone fortunate enough to find it. And in doing so, they had discovered that the greatest adventures weren't found in distant places, but in the daily choice to love generously, live honestly, and open their doors to whatever tomorrow might bring.